In 1892, the body of 19-year-old Mercy Brown was exhumed from a Baptist church cemetery in Exeter, Rhode Island. Her body was surprisingly well preserved, a fact that led locals to believe that she wasn't truly dead. This is a story of Mercy Lena Brown, and although chilling and bizarre in nature, it's just one story among many like it that span over 100 years. A man by the name of George Brown, the patriarch of his family, which aside from himself included his wife Mary Eliza, his son Edwin, and his two daughters Mary Olive and Mercy, lived in Exeter, Rhode Island. The year was 1883. In December of that year, mother and wife Mary Eliza died from tuberculosis, which at the time was known as consumption. The following year, Mary Olive, at the age of just 20, suffered the same fate. In 1891, Mary Olive's brother Edwin, known as a strong and healthy young man, also contracted the disease, and his health saw a rapid decline. In an attempt to rid himself of the all-consuming disease, he moved away to a Colorado Springs sanitarium, designed to treat those with consumption, in the hope that the warmer climate would save him, and for some time, although still suffering, he clung to life. When Edwin Brown returned to Rhode Island in 1892, he found his 19-year-old sister Mercy in the grips of the disease. She had been suffering for months, and it appeared that she was now on the brink of death. In January of 1892, Mercy Brown died at the age of 19. Her obituary simply read, "Miss Mercy Lena Brown, who has been suffering from consumption, died Sunday morning." Because they were apparently the only family in the area affected, it was suggested to George that his family may be cursed. Not only that, but such was the level of superstition at the time, people began to believe that the Brown women were actually undead and were thriving off the life force of Edwin. George Brown was faced with great pressure from a scared community when asked for permission to exhume his wife and daughter's bodies. If the Brown women showed any sign of life, their vital organs would be destroyed, a ritual that was hoped to stop the spread of the contagion and save Edwin's life, not to mention others who may be affected. The local doctor, Harold Metcalf, thought the ritual to be absurd, but agreed that George needed to come up with a satisfactory solution to calm down the panicked townspeople. George Brown reluctantly gave 4 friends permission to have his wife and daughter's bodies exhumed, but refused to be present. On the morning of March 17, 1892, the bodies of Mary Eliza, Mary Olive and Mercy were raised from the cemetery in Exeter, then known as Shrub Hill Cemetery. Some sources say that Dr. Metcalf and 4 men travelled to the cemetery together to exhume the bodies, but author Michael E. Bell, in his respected book Food for the Dead, On the Trail of the New England's Vampires, which was a constant reference for me, states that when Metcalf, who attended to Mercy during her illness, went to the cemetery as requested, he found that the men were already present and had taken up the body of Mary Eliza Brown. It was then that the bodies of Mary Olive and Mercy were exhumed. Both Marys had been in the ground for many years by now, so little remained of their corpses apart from traces of mummified flesh, but when they exhumed Mercy, they found her body to be extraordinarily preserved, with blood still present in the heart. Some say that Mercy was placed in a vault at the rear of the cemetery for 2 months prior to burial because the ground was too hard to dig, having been frozen solid. The fact that Mercy had died during a very cold spell may well have been the reason decomposition slowed down, but to the 19th century community, it appeared to be something far more sinister. Her body was also said to be in a different position, and her hair and nails had grown significantly. Dr. Metcalf explained that this second characteristic was natural after death, but regardless of his explanation, It was concluded that Mercy Brown was the culprit, and from beyond the grave, she was feeding off the blood of her dying brother. Following her exhumation, her heart and liver were removed and burnt on a rock. The remaining ashes were mixed with water and fed to Edwin. The belief was that this act of cannibalism would reverse the symptoms. The ritual ultimately failed, and Edwin Brown died on May 2, 1892, aged 24. What remained of Mercy's violated body was finally laid to rest at Shrub Hill Cemetery. In 1981, an Exeter-based descendant of Mercy Brown by the name of Everett Peck said that he had heard that Mercy Brown's body had changed position in her coffin, and his theory for this was that she may have been buried alive due to poor judgment by the medical examiner. Peck went on to recall a curious incident in the 1960s. He said that he was at the cemetery, stood a short distance from Mercy's grave, when he saw a bright ball of light hovering above the ground next to the grave. "I was scared to death," he said. "I've never seen anything like it before or since." Although he had openly expressed his non-belief in the vampire theory, Everett Peck was sometimes ridiculed in his hometown because local press had in the past written about his experiences in a manner that would suggest that he and his family were uneducated, superstitious people who believed in vampires. In the 19th century, this big city belief that people from New England towns were less than intelligent was apparent. At the time of Mercy Brown's exhumation, the newspaper Providence Journal cruelly wrote, "There are considerable elements of rural population in this part of the country, upon which the forces of education and civilization have made scarcely any impression." Everett Peck explained in 1981 that he'd never heard any mention of vampires in the area until interest in the Mercy Brown story had a resurgence in the mid to late 20th century, brought on by media coverage, which attracted tourists to the area who would hold night vigils in the cemetery. He also explained that the headstone at Mercy's grave had been defaced over time, after people had chipped away at the stone, taking away sections as souvenirs. Mercy Brown's grave today can be found at the same cemetery, now known as Chestnut Hill Cemetery, behind a small white Baptist church. At the rear of the cemetery stands the crypt which once contained her body. In August of 1996, the gravestone was taken, by whom is unknown, but it was returned a week later. It's strongly believed that Mercy Brown was the last exhumed corpse in what would become known as the Vampire Panic of New England. The word vampire entered the English language between 1730 and 1735, and it was not commonly used by family and friends of those afflicted. Newspapers that used the phrase vampire were likely influenced by the vampire beliefs in part of Eastern Europe. But even despite this European influence, the harm caused by the so-called New England vampires were considered to be psychic attacks from beyond the grave, rather than being carried out by walking undead creatures of the night, which was the image often portrayed in old vampire stories from Europe. However, it's worth mentioning that after Mercy Brown's exhumation, a number of people from Exeter did claim to have previously seen the girl walking in the fields at night, but these claims were not voiced until after her exhumation and reburial. Author Michael E. Bell in his aforementioned book wrote, "No credible account describes a corpse actually leaving the grave to suck blood, and there is little evidence to suggest that those involved in the practice refer to it as vampirism or to the suspected corpse as a vampire, although newspaper accounts used this term." In fact, after over 30 years of research, Bell says that he found no mention of people affected by the consumption epidemic as ever using the word vampire to describe the afflicted. It became apparent to him that it was just a word used by the press or by outsiders. He does mention, however, that in 2002 he found a graveyard in northern Rhode Island which contained the crumbling headstone of a man named Simon Whipple, who died on May 6, 1841. The only visible portion of the inscription read, "Although consumption's vampire grasp had seized thy mortal frame." The last few lines of the inscription were missing, but were found to belong to a poem by Eliza Earle, written in 1838. In order to better understand this story, it's worth going back in time a further 100 years, to the beginnings of the vampire panic. In the mid to late 18th century, an outbreak of consumption struck fear into what was then a civilization in its relatively early stages. A civilization that didn't have the understanding of disease and its effects as we do now. Consumption was named as such because of the all-consuming effects it had on the sufferer, resulting in severe physical deterioration before death. It was one of the leading causes of death in 19th century North America, not to mention its effects on Europe, and triggered a widespread panic as it swept through New England and the surrounding areas. By the year 1800, 1 in every 250 people in eastern USA was dying of consumption, and it accounted for 25% of all deaths. Nobody yet knew that the disease was airborne, so when one person in a family contracted it, it didn't take long for their other family members to follow. Those who showed symptoms, like Edwin Brown, were often sent to areas with milder climates in the hope that it would bring sufferers back to health. While this sometimes helped alleviate symptoms, it was also responsible for the further spread of the disease. Author of 1990's Vampires, Burial and Death, Paul Barber, wrote in his book that the outbreak spread so rapidly that darker forces were thought to be at hand, and people were actually prompted to seek out these so-called vampires to stop them destroying their friends and families. An 1896 issue of American Anthropologist includes an essay by George R. Stetson entitled The Animalistic Vampire in New England. In it, he links the behaviour attributed to the so-called New England vampire with cases recorded in Europe. Like the New England belief that the undead do not stop at one family member, cases found in Hungary, Turkey and Romania have said that a vampire continues to kill until the last member of the family is dead. One particular case stands out. This story, an alleged retelling of a personal experience by a Romanian family, is said to be from the early 20th century, so after the events that took place in New England, but the specifics of this story are startlingly similar to those in the Mercy Brown case. The story goes that an old Romanian woman died after suffering from an unspecified illness. The children of her eldest son were then claimed by the sickness, then the children of her youngest son. In an attempt to end the string of deaths, her sons dug up her body, cut her in two and reburied her. When another child died, she was exhumed for a second time, but found to be in one piece with no signs of a wound. They then took her body into a remote forest and placed it under a tree. The story goes on to say, there they disemboweled her, took out her heart, from which blood was flowing, cut it in four, put it on hot cinders and burnt it. They took the ashes and gave them to the children to drink with water. They threw the body on the fire, burnt it, and buried the ashes of the body. The deaths ceased. The act of adding the ashes to water and feeding them to the surviving children is uncannily similar to what happened when Edwin Brown drank the ashes of his sister. Although the date of this story is after the Mercy Brown incident, it's possible that similar cases had previously occurred in Europe before the time of Mercy Brown. So could this belief in New England be attributed to settlers in the US who brought with them old European folklore tales? At the time, many New Englanders blamed the disease on Native Americans, denying that it could have originated from their own ancestors, who had begun to arrive on US shores in the early 17th century. A Providence Journal article, written after the exhumation of Mercy Brown, claimed that residents of her hometown had said that vampirism was the practice of Native Americans. The macabre ritual that befell Mercy Brown after her death was just one instance of many like it. Here are the stories behind some of the others. "1784 saw the first recorded New England example of exhumation and mutilation as a cure for the spread of contagion. An unnamed doctor who said he knew of a most unusual cure for consumption contacted a suffering family from Willington, Connecticut. The Johnson family had, in the last 2 years, lost 2 family members, a son named Amos and a daughter named Elizabeth. A third child was said to be gravely ill. The doctor instructed their father, Isaac Johnson, to dig up the bodies of his children and search for the signs of plant growth through their vital organs. On June 1st, 1784, the bodies were dug up. When one of the bodies was found to have a plant growing out of it, the doctor told Isaac that he should burn the weed, as well as their hearts, in order to rid the family of the disease. Their corpses were then exhumed, and organs were removed. The doctor's belief that destroying any plant found growing from the bodies would save the surviving family members was ridiculed. In June of 1784, a Hartford, Connecticut newspaper described him as a quack doctor, and said that the public ought to be aware of this impostor. 15 years after the ritual, Isaac Johnson suffered a tragic death. On December 23, 1799, while carrying the timbers of a newly erected church, he was pinned to the ground by one of these timbers and killed outright. His blood was said to have remained visible on the wooden beam for more than 30 years. This may have been seen as divine retribution by many for his actions in 1784. An article printed in an 1884 issue of the Vermont Historical Magazine sheds light on the doctor's unusual theory. It said, "Among the superstitions of those days, we find it was said that a vine or root of some kind grew from coffin to coffin of those of one family who died of consumption and were buried side by side, and when the growing vine had reached the coffin of the last one buried, another one of the family would die. The only way to destroy the influence or effect was to break the vine, take up the body of the last one buried, and burn the vitals." A man by the name of Bristow Congdon, along with 3 of his many children, had died of consumption. One of the children was exhumed, and just like the previous cases, had their vital organs burnt in the hope that it would save the remaining family. It's unknown whether this worked. When writing about the Congdon family case, Frederick Denison, in his 1878 book, Westerly and Its Witnesses, described the act as a shallow and disgusting superstition, but then went on to say that similar cases have occurred in more enlightened families. Denison's book was an account specific to the town of Westerly in southwest Rhode Island. The case of Bristow Congdon and his children is the first reported case involving an African American family. This event happened in the mid-19th century, but no specific year was given. In 1854, the Connecticut paper The Norwich Courier reported on a case that occurred in Duet City in the same year. A man by the name of Henry Ray, sick with consumption, had already suffered the deaths of his 2 brothers, the last passing away in 1852. His brothers were to be dug up and cremated because it was feared they would ultimately be the demise of Henry Ray. On May 8, 1854, family and friends proceeded to the burial grounds, dug them up and burned their bodies on the spot. I should mention that the man at the centre of this case has, in past reports, been referred to as Horace Ray. According to the Providence Journal, in 1874, a 53-year-old man named William Rose, with the help of his friend Charles Harrington, exhumed the bodies of his son and daughter, buried near the shore of the Saugatucket River in South Kingstown. The siblings had died of consumption, and in an attempt to save his remaining family, he exhumed the bodies with a plan to burn their hearts and consume the ashes. His son had died of the disease 12 years prior, and on exhumation, both his coffin and body were found to be all but destroyed by decomposition. However, when he raised the body of his daughter, who had been in the ground for 7 years, he found that her coffin was in almost perfect condition, and that she was only partially decomposed. On seeing this, he believed that she was the cause of the curse, and removed what was left of her heart. He then set it alight, watched it burn, and consumed the remains. As an interesting footnote to this story, it's revealed that William Rose knew George Brown, Mercy Brown's father, and one day expressed his sympathy to George Brown in the wake of the death of his wife and daughters. He then told George his own story, and how he went about stopping the spread of the contagion. Could William Rose of South Kingstown have been the true influence behind George Brown's decision to exhume his wife and daughters? Author Sidney S. Rider's 1888 The Belief in Vampires tells the story of the Tillinghast family from Exeter, Rhode Island. The tale of Stuckley Tillinghast, his wife Honor Tillinghast, and their 14 children begins in 1799. After Mr. Tillinghast dreamt that his orchard of trees were withering away one by one, he became concerned. He did not know what it meant, but soon after his dream, his daughter Sarah fell ill with consumption. She passed away after a short bout with the disease, soon to be followed by her younger sister. In the weeks leading up to Sarah's death, her younger sister had complained of nightmares, in which Sarah was appearing in her room every night and sitting on her as she lay in bed, causing pain and discomfort. Similar visions haunted the other children in the family, and eventually 6 of the 14 Tillinghast children had died from the same disease. But when a 7th child, a son named James, became sick, Honor Tillinghast also began to complain of the same dream. Fearing that she and her son would soon suffer the same fate, friends and neighbours were called together, and it was agreed that all 6 children would be exhumed from their graves and their hearts burnt. When the exhumations took place, all was said to be in a bad state of decomposition, but Sarah Tillinghast, the eldest and first to die, was said to be in a remarkably good condition. Her eyes were open, her hair and nails had grown, and her heart was said to contain fresh blood. It was then removed, taken to a rock within the family's home and burnt. It's often been reported that Honor Tillinghast survived, but James did not. But this part of the story was thrown into confusion in 1995, when the will of the same James Tillinghast was found by his descendants. It was dated 1810, meaning that he lived well beyond Sarah's exhumation. The Tillinghast story has been written about and told many times over the years, with variations of details each time. Therefore it's difficult, as it is with all of these cases, to be 100% accurate. There are many Tillinghast family plots in New England, but the Tillinghasts in question here are buried at the Rhode Island Historical Cemetery 14, although many of the graves have now sunken or disappeared completely. Frederick Ransom of South Woodstock, Vermont, died of consumption on February 14, 1817, at the age of 20. His father, who had heard of the grisly consumption remedy and had faith in it, was sure that Frederick's illness would soon befall his remaining family. So he had his son's heart removed after exhumation and destroyed it in fire. This, however, did not save Frederick's mother, sister and 2 of his brothers, but his younger brother Daniel did survive and lived into his 80s. Daniel Ransom's memoirs include a message describing how his father burnt the organ in a blacksmith's forge. All the stories I have found are, in essence, very similar, as you have heard, so I won't go on for fear of repetition. However, there is one more case that needs to be addressed. It doesn't involve the consumption epidemic or incinerated organs, but it is a legend that attracted a lot of attention from the late 20th century until the present day. The West Greenwich case of Nellie Vaughan stands alone in the sense that it was never actually cited in any publication until 1977, when it appeared in the Rhode Island newspaper Westerly Sun. This story appears to be a classic case of urban legend, a story that spread from person to person after a single misunderstanding of the facts. According to Michael E. Bell, the earliest verbal reference to Nellie Vaughan as a vampire was a story told to high school students by a teacher at Coventry High School, Rhode Island, sometime in the late 1960s or early 70s. He could find no information about the elusive high school teacher, but Bell concludes that if a story had been told, the teller was simply relaying the story of Mercy Brown having forgotten her name, and it was the students whom, after going in search of the grave, stumbled across the wrong plot at Plain Meeting House Baptist Church in Greenwich, which lies only 15 miles west of Chestnut Hill Cemetery, the location of Mercy Brown's grave. On reading the now famous inscription on Nellie Vaughan's tombstone, "I am waiting and watching for you," it is possible that the excited teenagers assumed this to be the correct grave, giving birth to a new urban legend. One of the most commonly talked about aspects of the case is that no vegetation grows on the grave of Nellie Vaughan. This has been attributed to the belief that the site is cursed and therefore no living organism could survive on or around the tombstone. Skeptics believe that this is simply a case of wear and tear. The fact that her grave is so commonly visited, touched and tampered with, means that no vegetation has the chance to claim the stone. The consumption disease and the burning of organs have been added to the Nellie Vaughan story over time. The fact is, Nellie Vaughan died of pneumonia, not consumption, on March 31st, 1889. Her body was exhumed though on October 26, 1889, by the request of her mother. Nellie was moved from the family farm plot to the West Greenwich Baptist Church Cemetery, also known as Plain Meeting House Cemetery in West Greenwich, Rhode Island, but this didn't involve any kind of mutilation ritual. It's likely that this exhumation fueled the fires of urban legend, leading storytellers to believe that her spirit was restless after being moved. The inscription on the gravestone, "I am waiting and watching for you," was probably intended to mean watching from heaven, a far more pleasant message than the sinister one that has been passed down over the years since the legend began. Interestingly, the statements of a man, whom in the 1980s was over 100 years old and claimed to know Nellie Vaughan personally, said that there had never been any talk of her being a vampire before or after her death, that is, until the 1970s. Ghost stories, along with the tales of vampirism, also accompany the Nellie Vaughan story. Some have claimed to have seen a woman in Victorian dress walking the grounds of the cemetery, especially around the tombstone of Nellie Vaughan. There are also stories of auditory phenomenon, most commonly from people who have said that they've heard a woman say, "I am perfectly pleasant." This was reportedly first heard in 1993 by a Coventry man, who also claims to have been scratched by an unseen hand, leaving visible marks on his face. The alleged message from Nellie Vaughan is often cited as meaning, "I am friendly, I am not a vampire." Due to vandalism over the years, the gravestone was eventually moved to an undisclosed location, but as far as ghost hunters and curious tourists are concerned, this has only added to the mystique of Nellie Vaughan. The New England vampire panic may not have been a tale of classic Hollywood vampirism, but it has influenced the romantic image of the vampire that we're familiar with today. For example, following the death of Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula in 1897, newspaper accounts of the Mercy Brown story were said to be found in his files. Stephen King may have also been influenced by these stories, especially the Nellie Vaughan case, which was at the height of its popularity at the time he wrote Salem's Lot, a vampire story set in 1970s New England.